Naomi had always believed that family meant sacrifice, and for years she had lived by that principle. As a successful financial analyst in New York City, she had done everything she could to support her parents and younger twin siblings, Ethan and Eliza, covering their mortgage, tuition fees, and countless expenses. While others in their Miami social circle saw them as a well-off family living in a beautiful beachfront estate, Naomi knew the truth. Without her financial backing, their perfect image would crumble. She had never expected gratitude, but she had at least hoped for respect. That illusion shattered the moment she sat down for dinner at her parents' home. The setting was deceptively warm. The rich aroma of rosemary and garlic filled the air. The dining room was dimly lit by an elegant chandelier, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore drifted through the open patio doors. But beneath the cozy atmosphere, Naomi sensed an underlying tension, one she couldn't quite place. Ethan and Eliza sat across from her, smug grins on their faces, their expensive designer clothes a silent testament to her generosity. Their parents exchanged glances before her mother finally spoke, her tone carefully measured. "We wanted to tell you this in person," she said, placing her fork down. "Your father and I have finalized our will." Naomi barely had time to process those words before Ethan leaned forward, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Just so we're clear. Everything goes to us." The statement was like a gut punch. Naomi blinked, momentarily stunned. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Her mother sighed, as if she had anticipated this reaction. "Naomi, you have done so well for yourself. You have your own life, your own success. Ethan and Eliza, well, they need more support. It's only fair." Fair? Naomi's stomach churned. She had spent years making sure they had that support. She had sacrificed vacations, relationships, and personal luxuries so they could live comfortably. Ethan's failed real estate ventures? Paid for. Eliza's endless designer wardrobe? Funded. Their parents' mortgage? Covered. Yet now all of that was dismissed, as if it had never mattered. She turned to her father, searching for some sign of hesitation, but he refused to meet her eyes, staring blankly at the silverware in front of him. Naomi felt her breath hitch, a bitter realization settling in. This wasn't just a decision, they had already moved on from her. Eliza let out a small laugh, twirling a lock of perfectly styled hair around her finger. "Honestly, Naomi, did you think throwing money at us would make Mom and Dad love you more?" Heat flooded Naomi's face, her hands curling into fists beneath the table. She had spent years believing that family loyalty meant giving without expecting anything in return. But as she looked around at the people she had called family, it became painfully clear to them she had never been family, she had only ever been an ATM. Naomi's chest tightened as the weight of their words settled over her like a suffocating fog. The air in the dining room suddenly felt too thick, the once inviting meal now cold and tasteless on her plate. Her fingers clenched around the stem of her wine glass as she struggled to keep her voice steady. "What do you mean, everything?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, an insufferable smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Exactly what we said," he replied. "The house, the beach villa, everything Mom and Dad own, it's all going to us." His casual arrogance was infuriating, as if this was some well-played move in a game she never even knew she was a part of. Naomi turned to her parents, searching for some sign of regret, some indication that this was a mistake, a misunderstanding. But her mother only exhaled heavily, placing her napkin neatly beside her plate, as if Naomi's reaction was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Naomi, honey, this is for the best," she said, voice tinged with condescension. "You have a successful career. You're independent. Ethan and Eliza, they need more help finding their way." Naomi let out a sharp, bitter laugh. shaking her head in disbelief. "Help? I have been helping them my entire life," she snapped, unable to contain the frustration bubbling up inside her. Who covered Ethan's business loans after he blew through his savings on bad investments? Who paid for Eliza's fashion school tuition after she dropped out of 2 different programs? Who has been quietly covering this house's mortgage for the past 3 years? She turned toward her father, desperation creeping into her voice. "Dad, say something." But her father remained silent, his eyes fixed on his untouched plate. The betrayal was deeper than she had imagined. It wasn't just about money, it was about who mattered and who didn't. Eliza let out a soft chuckle, swirling the last bit of wine in her glass before taking a sip. "God, Naomi, you're acting like we forced you to help us," she said, her voice dripping with amusement. "You did that all on your own. Maybe you thought if you kept paying, Mom and Dad would love you as much as they love us?" The words hit Naomi like a slap, leaving a sting that burned deeper than any financial loss ever could. She had spent years sacrificing for her family, not out of obligation, but out of love. And now, in this moment, every sacrifice was being twisted into a weakness, a pathetic attempt to buy affection that was never there to begin with. Ethan scoffed, shaking his head. "Face it, Naomi, you just like playing the martyr. You always have. No one made you do any of this, but now that Mom and Dad won't hand you a prize for it, you're throwing a tantrum?" Naomi's vision blurred with the heat of her anger, her heart pounding against her ribs. "This isn't a tantrum," she said, voice deadly calm. "This is me realizing that I was never a part of this family, not in the way I thought." Her mother sighed, shaking her head in exasperation. "This is exactly why we didn't want to tell you. You always bring things back to money, Naomi. It's never about family with you." Naomi inhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the table as her world tilted on its axis. It had always been about family. Every late-night wire transfer, every canceled trip, every stressful spreadsheet balancing their expenses, it was all for family. Because they asked, because they needed her, because they convinced her that was what love looked like. But now, as she looked around at their unapologetic faces, their calculated indifference, she saw the truth. To them, she was never family. She was just their safety net. A deep, quiet rage settled inside her, burning hotter than the hurt. Naomi exhaled, steadying herself as she pushed her chair back. The legs scraped harshly against the polished hardwood floor, the sound slicing through the silence like a blade. She stood, ignoring the stunned looks on their faces. "You're right, Ethan," she said, voice cold and firm. "No one forced me. But from this moment forward, no one will ever guilt me into being this family's ATM again." Without another word, she turned, leaving behind the people who had never truly seen her as anything more than a bank account. The city skyline flickered through the window as Naomi sat alone in her New York apartment, a glass of wine clutched tightly in her hand. The expensive bottle, one she had been saving for a special occasion, now felt fitting for this moment. It wasn't a celebration, but it was an awakening. She swirled the deep red liquid absent-mindedly, her mind replaying the dinner conversation on a cruel, endless loop. The smugness in Ethan's voice, the amusement in Eliza's eyes, and worst of all, the cold, calculated indifference of her parents. She had spent years believing that love was something to be earned, something she could buy with self-sacrifice and financial support. But now, the truth was laid bare. They had never valued her beyond what she could provide. Her phone buzzed for what felt like the 100th time, the screen lighting up with her mother's name. Naomi didn't need to listen to the voicemail to know what it would say. "Naomi, stop being so dramatic. Family doesn't treat each other like this. Call me back." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Family doesn't treat each other like this? That was rich, coming from the woman who had sat there in silence as Naomi was cast aside like a disposable asset. Tossing her phone onto the couch, Naomi reached for her laptop, pulling up her online banking app. Every expense stared back at her like a list of quiet betrayals. The recurring $4,200 mortgage payment she had been covering for her parents, Ethan's last-minute tuition reimbursements, Eliza's monthly credit card payments, the ones she had excused as just until she gets her business off the ground. Naomi's fingers hovered over the screen, her breath shallow as she stared at the financial leash she had willingly tied around her own neck. For years she had let guilt dictate her decisions, convinced herself that giving more, sacrificing more, was the key to keeping her family close. But it had never been enough. It was never going to be enough. With a deep breath, she moved her cursor to the payment schedule, clicking through the details one by one. The first one was the hardest, her parents' mortgage payment. The thought of them struggling without her support twisted in her stomach, but then she remembered how easily they had discarded her when she was no longer useful. Cancel. The utilities bill disappeared next. Cancel. Ethan's never-ending tuition reimbursement, gone. Cancel. Eliza's shopping habits no longer her problem. With each confirmation screen that flashed before her, Naomi felt something unfamiliar stir within her. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't regret. It was relief. A quiet, simmering defiance bubbled in her chest as she stared at the empty list of payments, her bank account no longer bleeding for people who had no love for her beyond what she could provide. The buzzing of her phone pulled her from her thoughts. Another call from her mother. Then Ethan. Then Eliza. One after the other like vultures realizing their meal ticket had vanished. Naomi let them ring, ignoring every last desperate attempt to pull her back into their grasp. She wasn't their safety net anymore. For the first time in years, Naomi was free. Naomi had expected backlash. She knew her family wouldn't take her defiance lightly. The missed payments would have sent them into a panic, especially Ethan, whose reckless spending habits had made him particularly dependent on her generosity. But she hadn't anticipated just how far they would go to punish her. It had been a grueling week at work, long meetings in San Francisco with high-profile clients, the kind of distraction she welcomed after cutting off her family financially. The exhaustion settled deep in her bones as she arrived back in New York, dragging her suitcase down the hallway of her high-rise apartment building. She exhaled, already dreaming of a long shower, a glass of wine, and a quiet night to herself. But when she reached her door, her breath caught in her throat. The entire doorframe was sealed shut with expanding foam, thick and hardened, oozing out from every crevice like some grotesque prank gone too far. The lock, the handle, completely encased. Naomi took a step back, her pulse pounding in her ears as she took in the full extent of the damage. Someone had deliberately sabotaged her entrance, ensuring she couldn't get inside. A slow, sickening realization settled in. This wasn't random. This was personal. Her fingers trembled as she reached out to touch the hardened foam, the reality of the situation setting in. Ethan. It had to be him. The entitlement, the spite, it all led back to him. Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line as a wave of anger coursed through her. This wasn't just retaliation. This was a warning. She fumbled for her phone, quickly dialing the building's management office. "Someone vandalized my apartment," she said, trying to keep her voice calm despite the fury bubbling beneath the surface. "I need a locksmith. Now." It took 2 hours before maintenance and security arrived, and another hour before the locksmith managed to pry open her ruined door. The foam had seeped into every crack, hardening into an impenetrable barrier. "This wasn't random," the locksmith muttered, shaking his head as he chipped away at the mess. "Whoever did this wanted to make sure you couldn't get in." Naomi didn't need confirmation. She already knew. Once inside, she sank onto her couch, exhaustion battling against the simmering rage threatening to consume her. Then a thought struck her. Her security camera. She had installed a small, discreet hallway camera months ago, never thinking she'd actually need it. With shaky hands, she opened the app, scrolling through the recent footage. And there he was. Ethan. The video played in sharp clarity. Ethan, dressed in a hoodie, baseball cap pulled low over his face, crouched in front of her door. The timestamp showed he had done it 2 nights ago, under the cover of darkness. He worked quickly, spraying the foam methodically, stepping back to admire his work before walking away without a hint of hesitation. Naomi's stomach churned. This wasn't just a petty grudge. This was cruelty. Her first instinct was to call him, to demand an explanation, but what would that accomplish? He didn't regret what he did. He wanted her to suffer. Instead, she called Aunt Camille. The phone barely rang before the warm, familiar voice answered. "Naomi?" She exhaled shakily, gripping the phone tighter. "It's Ethan," she said. "He vandalized my apartment. I have proof." A long silence. Then, Camille's voice, firm and unwavering. "You need to report him." Naomi hesitated. Despite everything, he was still her brother. Could she really escalate things to that level? But then she remembered the look on his face in the footage, the smugness, the lack of hesitation. He had done this knowing full well the consequences, fully believing he'd get away with it. She straightened, her resolve solidifying. "You're right," she said. "It's time he learns there are consequences." The next morning, Naomi filed a police report and handed over the footage as evidence. If Ethan thought she would just roll over and accept his cruelty, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Naomi knew the moment she filed the police report that her family wouldn't take it quietly. The first wave of outrage came in the form of furious calls and voicemails, her mother's voice dripping with indignation. "Naomi, how could you do this? You don't turn on family. You could ruin Ethan's future over a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding? Naomi scoffed as she listened, staring at the security footage of her brother vandalizing her door. There was no misunderstanding, just entitlement, arrogance, and the absolute certainty that he could do anything without consequences. She deleted the voicemail and blocked the number. But the retaliation didn't stop there. The real damage came when her mother took their version of events to the rest of the family. Aunt Camille was the first to warn her. "Your mom's been talking," she said over the phone. "She's telling everyone you abandoned them, that you're punishing your parents financially and trying to make them homeless." Naomi's stomach twisted. Of course they had turned this around. They had rewritten history, painting her as the villain. For years, she had silently taken care of them, ensuring their bills were paid, their lifestyle maintained. Now they were making it seem like she had cruelly cut them off out of spite. She didn't even need to check social media. The flood of messages from extended relatives said it all. Some were scolding her. "I can't believe you would do this to your own parents. They raised you." Others were more cautious, simply asking, "Naomi, is this true?" But the worst were the ones that outright dismissed her pain. "Family is family. You don't just walk away over money." Naomi felt something inside her snap. For years, she had swallowed her resentment, played to the dutiful daughter, and let them walk all over her. But she had spent too long being quiet, and she wasn't going to be quiet anymore. That night, she sat down with her laptop and wrote everything. A long, unfiltered post laying out every single expense she had covered, every mortgage payment, every tuition bill, every frivolous shopping spree she had funded for Eliza, every reckless business failure of Ethan's she had bailed out. She detailed the manipulation, the gaslighting, and the ultimate betrayal at the dinner table. She didn't embellish, didn't exaggerate, just the raw truth. And then she hit post. The response was immediate. Friends, colleagues, and even distant family members flooded the comments. Some were shocked, apologizing for judging her without knowing the full story. Others were still angry, insisting that family should come before money. But the biggest reaction came from the people who had once blindly defended her parents. Her mother's reaction was predictable. A screaming voicemail. "How dare you humiliate us like this? You had no right to air our family's dirty laundry." Naomi listened, shaking her head. No right. They had no right to make her the villain just to cover their own guilt. She called her mother back, her voice steady. "You lied about me. You tried to turn people against me. I won't let you rewrite my story to make yourself look better. You've destroyed this family," her mother hissed. "No," Naomi said, her voice calm but firm. "You did that yourselves." She hung up, feeling lighter than she had in years. In the weeks following her public revelation, Naomi felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping into her daily life. Peace. The constant phone calls and guilt-tripping messages had slowed to a trickle, and with each day that passed, she felt herself breathing a little easier. There was no more dread when she checked her phone, no more waking up to a barrage of accusations disguised as concern. For the first time in years, she was free. She threw herself into her work at Wallace & Burke Financial Group, diving into projects with a clarity she hadn't experienced in a long time. Without the weight of her family's financial burdens, she was able to focus, excel, and even take on new leadership opportunities. A promotion was already on the horizon, something she could now actually celebrate, because for once she was working for herself, not just to support those who saw her as a bank account. Then, on a quiet evening after work, she booked the trip. For years she had fantasized about visiting Paris. Every time she had considered going, she had talked herself out of it. There was always some financial crisis at home, some urgent bill to cover, some guilt-driven reason to put herself last. But now, there was nothing holding her back. No more endless transfers draining her savings. No more excuses. The moment she stepped off the plane at Charles de Gaulle Airport, a rush of emotions hit her. This was her moment, her decision, her life. Walking through the cobblestone streets of Montmartre, sipping coffee at a quiet cafe, standing in front of the Eiffel Tower at sunset. Every experience felt like a reclamation of the years she had given away. She wasn't just escaping her family's toxicity. She was finally living. And then there was Damien. She met him on a hiking trip a month after returning home. A quiet, charming architect with an easy smile and a way of listening that made her feel like she was the only person in the world. At first, Naomi was hesitant. She had spent so long giving to others, expecting nothing in return, that she wasn't sure what a healthy relationship even looked like. But Damien didn't demand anything from her. He supported her without expectation, without strings attached. For the first time, Naomi allowed herself to enjoy companionship without the burden of obligation. Damien didn't see her as a provider, a fixer, or an ATM. He saw her as a person. And that, more than anything, was what she had been searching for all along. One evening, while sipping wine on her apartment balcony overlooking New York, Naomi received a visit from Aunt Camille. She hadn't seen her since the fallout with the family, and for a brief moment, Naomi feared this would be yet another attempt to pull her back in. But when Camille embraced her, there was only warmth. "I'm proud of you, Naomi," she said softly. "You chose yourself. That's not selfish. That's bravery." Naomi felt something tighten in her chest. All these years, she had been chasing validation from the wrong people. But here, with Camille, with Damien, with her career thriving and her own happiness finally within reach, she realized she had everything she needed. She smiled, gripping Camille's hand. "For the first time, I finally feel free." Months had passed since Naomi severed ties with her family, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was truly in control of her own destiny. She had reclaimed her finances, rediscovered her passions, and built meaningful connections outside of the toxic cycle she once called family. But deep down, she knew that they wouldn't stay silent forever. The text came on a Friday afternoon, flashing across her phone screen like a warning. "Family meeting tonight. Naomi, you owe it to us to be there." Her heart hammered. Owe it to them? After everything? A part of her wanted to ignore it, to pretend she hadn't seen it. But another part, the part that still carried years of anger, resentment, and unanswered questions, knew she had to face them one last time. Not to fix things, not to apologize, but to end this once and for all. Pulling into the driveway of her childhood home in Miami, she was hit with a wave of emotions. The grand estate, once a symbol of family and warmth, now felt foreign and unwelcoming. Ethan and Eliza's cars were already parked out front, their luxury vehicles standing as a reminder of how much they had taken from her. Naomi inhaled sharply, bracing herself for the final confrontation. Inside, her parents were seated stiffly in the living room, their expressions unreadable. Ethan leaned casually against the fireplace, while Eliza scrolled through her phone, looking bored. The tension in the air was suffocating. Her father was the first to speak. "Naomi, your mother and I thought you'd come to your senses by now. Obviously, we were mistaken." Naomi clenched her fists. Come to her senses? Was that what they thought? That she'd break down, come crawling back, and resume her role as their financial crutch? She took a slow breath. "You cut me out of your will. You dismissed everything I've ever done for this family, and now, after I've walked away, you want me back?" Her voice was steady, but the fire in her chest burned hotter with every word. Her mother scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Stop exaggerating. You helped, sure, but that was your responsibility as the oldest. Ethan and Eliza deserve stability." Naomi let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Stability?" she echoed. "I gave up my stability so you could keep yours. I spent years sacrificing my time, my money, my peace. For what? So you could tell me it was never enough?" Eliza smirked. "Maybe if you weren't so obsessed with playing the family savior, you'd have your own life by now." Naomi's rage simmered into cold certainty. She stood, chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "You're right. That was my mistake, thinking I ever mattered here. I won't make that mistake again." Her father's voice was sharp. "If you walk out that door, don't expect to come back." Naomi turned, hand on the doorknob. She looked over her shoulder, voice unwavering. "I never felt welcome here anyway." And with that, she walked away for the last time. The night air in New York City was crisp as Naomi stood on her apartment balcony, gazing at the skyline. The final confrontation with her family had left a lingering ache in her chest. But it wasn't regret. It was the weight of years of manipulation finally lifting, leaving behind something unfamiliar, yet profoundly liberating. Peace. In the weeks that followed, silence replaced the chaos. No more phone calls, no more guilt-ridden voicemails, no more attempts to drag her back into a family that had only seen her as a resource. They had chosen their side, and for once, she had chosen herself. Her parents were struggling now, forced to take part-time jobs. They could no longer rely on her financial safety net. Ethan, drowning in debt, had lost his real estate license. Eliza's influencer career never took off, and her carefully curated lifestyle was crumbling. Naomi didn't gloat over their misfortune, but she also didn't feel compelled to save them. They had made their choices. Now, they had to live with them. Instead of dwelling on what was lost, Naomi focused on what she had gained, her own life. That December, instead of spending the holidays drowning in obligation, she hosted a dinner for friends and colleagues, people who valued her for who she was, not for what she could provide. Aunt Camille arrived, bringing a bottle of wine and a warm, knowing smile. As the night filled with laughter, Naomi realized that family wasn't about blood, it was about those who truly saw you, respected you, and cared for you. As the last guest left, Naomi stood alone in her apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for approval, for validation, for permission to live on her own terms. Her parents thought that cutting her out of their will would break her, but they had given her something far more valuable. They had given her freedom. The greatest lesson from Naomi's journey is that self-worth is not defined by what you give to others, but by how you value yourself. For years, she believed that family loyalty meant sacrifice, financially, emotionally, and mentally. She poured everything into supporting her parents and siblings, only to realize that her sacrifices were never truly appreciated, only expected. Her story teaches us that boundaries are necessary, even with family. Love should never come with conditions, and respect should never be one-sided. Naomi's decision to walk away wasn't about revenge or bitterness. It was about reclaiming her own life. She learned that choosing herself wasn't selfish, it was survival. Another key takeaway is that people will try to rewrite your story to serve their own interests. Naomi's family tried to paint her as the villain when she stopped financially supporting them, but by standing firm, she exposed the truth. Ultimately, the story reminds us that family isn't about blood. It's about those who truly respect and support you. Letting go of toxic relationships, no matter how difficult, can be the first step toward true freedom and happiness. Sometimes, losing people is how you finally find yourself.